Nevira fidgeted with the hem of her tunic, her small fingers tracing the intricate patterns that marked her as a member of the esteemed Libran species. Esteemed, of course, by everyone except their own males. She glanced around the intergalactic speed-dating chamber, a gaudy, pulsating room filled with beings of every imaginable shape, size, and questionable odor. Her latest date, a six-eyed creature with antennae twitching in obvious impatience, squinted at her. "You're a Libran, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with boredom. "A bit flat for my tastes. I like a partner who casts a shadow, you know?" Nevira resisted the urge to lunge across the table and throttle him. "Well," she said, forcing a tight smile, "I like a partner who doesn't drool on their dinner. Guess we're both disappointed." The buzzer blared, signaling the end of yet another fruitless interaction. Nevira sighed and shuffled to the next table, already bracing herself for disappointment. The tentacle being waiting for her recoiled the moment she sat down. "Too dry," it gurgled, its voice sloshing like wet socks. "I prefer someone with a bit more lubrication." "Well," Nevira snapped, "you look like someone left their noodles in the sun too long, so maybe we're even." The tentacle alien made a noise that could have been a laugh or a burp, it was hard to tell, before slithering away. She slumped in her chair, glancing around the room. Everywhere, she saw connections being made, an eight-limbed alien twirling an overenthusiastic insectoid around the room, a hulking reptilian whispering sweet nothings to a being that resembled a sentient disco ball. But Nevira? She'd struck out again. The truth was, Libran males were notorious for their impossible standards. Females had to be tall, symmetrical, and capable of juggling plasma orbs while reciting poetry in 3 galactic dialects. Nevira, with her petite frame and dry humor, had always been deemed lacking. Not graceful enough. Not dazzling enough. Not enough, period. She tossed back the last of her drink, some unidentifiable alien concoction that tasted like regret, and stalked out of the chamber. Outside, the cold air of the starport bit at her skin. The lights of distant ships blinked like mocking eyes, each one carrying passengers who probably weren't destined to die alone. "Why do I even try?" she muttered, kicking a pebble that clattered uselessly against the metal floor. "Clearly, the galaxy has decided I'm better off as a spinster." Blip, her ship's AI, chimed in her ear. "Statistically, the probability of a successful mating encounter for you is currently at 0.003%. Would you like me to recalibrate expectations?" "Shut up, Blip." The AI's voice softened into what it probably thought was comforting. "Might I suggest focusing on self-improvement? Plasma orb juggling tutorials are trending on the Libran homeworld." "Shut up twice, Blip." Nevira boarded her small, somewhat battered ship, slumping into the cockpit with a huff. The console lights blinked lazily, as if mocking her mood. She stared at the controls for a long moment before muttering, "Let's get out of here. Anywhere but here." Blip hesitated. "Coordinates?" "Surprise me," she said, leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes. "Just surprise me." The engines roared to life, and the ship shot off into the inky expanse of space. As the stars blurred into streaks of light, Nevira felt the weight of rejection lift, just a little. Maybe, she thought, it wasn't about finding the perfect partner. Maybe it was about getting as far away as possible from the judgmental pricks who didn't appreciate her. Or maybe, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, it was about finding someone who did. Someone who didn't care about juggling skills or symmetrical cheekbones. Someone who'd see her sharp wit and dry humor as endearing instead of abrasive. Someone who'd look at her and think, "She's perfect, just as she is." Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt. The ship lurched violently, alarms blaring. Blip's voice was annoyingly calm. "Hull integrity compromised. Emergency landing required." "What?" Nevira shot upright, her heart racing. "Where?" Blip paused, as if considering the least helpful response possible. "Nearest habitable planet detected. Brace for impact." The ship shuddered again, and Nevira gripped the armrests as they hurtled toward an unfamiliar world. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the surface rushing up to meet her. When she came to, the cockpit was filled with smoke, and the lights flickered weakly. Nevira groaned, unbuckling herself and staggering to her feet. Outside the shattered viewport, she saw a barren landscape bathed in the warm glow of twin suns. Blip's voice crackled to life. "Congratulations on surviving the crash? Shall I add this to your list of achievements?" "Please do," Nevira muttered, kicking open the hatch. She stepped out onto the dusty ground, squinting against the bright sunlight. Her ship was a smoking wreck, half buried in a crater of its own making. And standing at the edge of the crater, staring at her with a mix of curiosity and disbelief, was a human. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a scruffy beard that framed a lopsided grin, he looked like someone who'd just stepped out of one of those human adventure holos. He was holding what appeared to be a cup of coffee, the steam curling lazily in the air. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a strange warmth. "You don't see that every day." Nevira blinked at him, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or demand an explanation. What are you?" He raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm human. Jake, to be exact. And you just crashed into my backyard." Nevira stood at the edge of the crater, her gaze fixed on the human who had introduced himself as Jake. He didn't seem fazed by the fact that an alien had just crash-landed on his planet. If anything, he looked mildly amused, like he'd just found an interesting new creature for his collection. "You're human?" she asked, still trying to process the situation. "Last time I checked," Jake replied with a shrug. "And you're not from around here, obviously." Nevira groaned, rubbing her temples. "No, I'm not. And now my ship is a pile of space junk." "Perfect." Jake set his coffee down on a nearby rock and climbed into the crater with an ease that surprised her. He offered a hand, his grin warm and oddly reassuring. "Need help?" She hesitated. His hand was large and calloused, clearly accustomed to hard work. Her own was small and delicate by comparison, but she swallowed her pride and took it. His grip was firm but gentle, and he pulled her out of the crater as if she weighed nothing at all. "Thanks," she muttered, brushing dust off her tunic. "No problem," he said, studying her with an expression that was more curious than judgmental. "So, what brings you to my corner of the galaxy?" "Not exactly a tourist hotspot. My ship decided to self-destruct," she said dryly. "Blip, my AI thought this would be a good place for an emergency landing. Apparently, the definition of habitable is up for debate." Jake chuckled. "Well, it's habitable enough for me. Been stationed here for a while now, studying the local ecosystem. Not much to do except work and drink bad coffee." He paused, his grin widening. "Guess I can add meeting a sarcastic alien to the list." Nevira rolled her eyes. "Lucky you." He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that caught her off guard. Most of the males she'd encountered, alien or otherwise, had laughed at her, not with her. But Jake's amusement felt different. It wasn't mocking or dismissive. It was warm, like he genuinely enjoyed her company. "So," he said, gesturing toward her ship, "is it fixable?" Nevira glanced at the wreckage and sighed. "Maybe. If I can find the right parts. Which, considering I'm stranded on a backwater planet with nothing but dirt and rocks, seems unlikely." Jake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I've got a workshop with some tools and spare parts. It's mostly human tech, but you're welcome to take a look. Might be something useful." She blinked, surprised by the offer. "You'd help me? Just like that?" "Sure," he said with a shrug. "Why not? It's not every day a tiny alien crashes into my yard. Besides, you look like you could use a break." Nevira wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or insulted, but the idea of fixing her ship was enough to keep her quiet. "Fine. Lead the way, human." "Jake," he corrected, his grin never faltering. "And you are?" "Nevira," she said reluctantly. "Nice to meet you, Nevira." He started walking, and she followed, her small frame dwarfed by his broad shoulders. The journey to his workshop was short but gave her plenty of time to take in her surroundings. The landscape was barren, with only a few scraggly plants dotting the rocky terrain. Jake's workshop turned out to be a modest but well-organized space filled with tools, gadgets, and half-finished projects. Nevira eyed the clutter warily, unsure whether it was a treasure trove or a death trap. "Make yourself at home," Jake said, clearing a spot on a workbench. "Let me know if you see anything that looks useful." Nevira climbed onto a stool, her legs dangling off the edge. She scanned the shelves, her eyes landing on a few components that might work. "This could do," she said, pointing to a small device. Jake handed it to her, watching as she inspected it with practiced precision. "You're good at this," he said, sounding impressed. "Comes with the territory," she said, not looking up. "Librans are known for their technical skills. Too bad it doesn't make us more dateable." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Dateable?" she sighed, setting the device down. "Let's just say I'm not exactly popular with the males of my species." "Why not?" he asked, genuinely curious. Nevira hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about Jake's open demeanor made her feel safe. "I'm too small. Too sarcastic. Not symmetrical enough. Libran males are obsessed with perfection, and I'm not it." Jake frowned. "Sounds like their loss." She glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "You're just saying that." "No, I mean it," he said, leaning against the workbench. "Where I come from, being unique is a good thing. And for what it's worth, I think you're pretty great." Nevira felt her cheeks heat up, a rare reaction for her species. "You barely know me," she muttered, trying to brush it off. "True," he said with a playful smirk. "But first impressions count, and so far, you've made a pretty good one." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused on the device in her hands. But her mind kept drifting back to Jake's words. No one had ever called her great before. As they worked together, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. Jake told her stories about his life on Earth, his adventures as an explorer, and his ongoing battle with the station's terrible coffee machine. Nevira found herself laughing more than she had in years, her usual sarcasm tempered by genuine amusement. In return, she shared snippets of her own life, her struggles with Libran society, her failed attempts at dating, and her decision to leave it all behind. Jake listened intently, his expressions ranging from sympathy to outright laughter. By the time the suns began to set, they'd made significant progress on repairing her ship. Nevira was exhausted but surprisingly content. "You know," Jake said as they packed up for the day, "you're not what I expected." She raised an eyebrow. "What were you expecting?" "Something less interesting," he admitted with a grin. "But you've definitely proven me wrong." For the first time in a long while, Nevira felt a genuine smile tug at her lips. "Guess I'm full of surprises." "That you are," Jake said, his tone warm and teasing. As they walked back toward the crash site, Nevira found herself stealing glances at him. He was unlike anyone she'd ever met, alien in his own way but oddly familiar at the same time. Maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally starting to change. The next morning, Nevira woke to the sound of clattering metal and a muffled curse. She groggily sat up, realizing she'd fallen asleep inside Jake's workshop, curled up on a surprisingly comfortable stack of blankets. Blip's voice chimed in her ear, irritatingly cheerful. "Good morning. Your human companion has been making quite a racket. Would you like to reprimand him?" "Not now, Blip," she muttered, stretching as she stood. She shuffled toward the source of the noise, finding Jake tinkering with a device on the workbench. "Morning," he said, glancing up with a sheepish grin. "Didn't mean to wake you. I was just trying to make something useful for your repairs." Her gaze fell on the mess of wires and parts in front of him. "That's ambitious." "Hey," he said, pretending to be offended. "Humans are known for our ingenuity, you know." "Sure," she said with a smirk. "That's why your coffee machine is the pinnacle of technological achievement." He chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, fair point. But this might actually help. She leaned over the workbench, inspecting his creation. It wasn't perfect, but it had potential. Not bad, she admitted reluctantly. For a beginner. High praise coming from you, he teased. As they worked together, Jake continued his efforts to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. He explained human customs with a mix of pride and self-deprecation, often stumbling over concepts that didn't quite translate. So, she said, raising an eyebrow, you're saying humans give each other rocks as a sign of love? Not just any rocks, he clarified. Diamonds. They're rare and valuable. Rare? She repeated, skeptical. On Libran, we use diamonds as paperweights. Jake stared at her for a moment before bursting into laughter. Well, that's humbling. She smirked, pleased with herself. I guess humans and Librans have different ideas of romance. Apparently, he said, still grinning. What about your people? What's considered romantic in your culture? She hesitated, her smirk fading. It's complicated. Librans value perfection above all else. Courtship rituals involve proving your worth through elaborate displays of skill and symmetry. It's exhausting. Sounds like a lot of pressure, Jake said, his tone softening. It is, she admitted. And no matter how hard I tried, I was never good enough. Jake's expression grew serious. That's ridiculous. You're smart, capable, and… He paused, his cheeks reddening slightly. Well, you're pretty great. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her reaction with a sarcastic remark. Careful, human. Flattery might actually work on me. Noted, he said with a playful grin. As the day went on, their banter became more comfortable, their differences feeling less like barriers and more like opportunities for connection. Jake showed her how to use some of his tools, his hands occasionally brushing against hers in a way that made her stomach flutter. At one point, she accidentally activated a device that emitted a loud, shrill noise, causing them both to jump. What did you do? Jake asked, covering his ears. I have no idea, she shouted over the noise. He scrambled to shut it off, laughing despite himself. You're a menace. And you're a terrible teacher, she shot back, grinning. Their laughter echoed through the workshop, a sound that felt strangely natural despite the absurdity of their situation. Later, as they took a break, Jake offered her a cup of what he called tea. It was warm and earthy, a welcome change from the bland nutrition cubes she was used to. This is actually good, she said, surprised. Glad you think so, he said, his smile widening. It's one of the few things I've mastered out here. Are all humans this resourceful? She asked, genuinely curious. Not all of us, he admitted. But we're pretty good at adapting. It's kind of our thing. She nodded thoughtfully. I can see that. You've got this resilience. It's impressive. Coming from you, that means a lot, he said, his tone sincere. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their respective pasts temporarily lifted. Nevira found herself stealing glances at him, her sharp eyes tracing the lines of his face. He was so different from anyone she'd ever known, rough around the edges but undeniably kind. Hey, he said, breaking the silence. I've been meaning to ask, why did you leave your homeworld? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her cup. I was tired of feeling like I didn't belong. Libran society is all about fitting into a mold, and I never fit. Leaving was the only way to find out if there's more to life than just being enough for someone else. Jake nodded, his expression serious. I get that. Sometimes you have to leave everything behind to figure out who you really are. Exactly, she said, surprised by how much his words resonated with her. He looked at her, his blue eyes steady and unwavering. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. You deserve to be somewhere you're appreciated for who you are. Her chest tightened, a strange warmth spreading through her. Thanks, Jake. That means a lot. He smiled, his gaze soft. Anytime. As the suns began to set, casting a golden glow over the workshop, Nevira realized that for the first time in years, she felt truly seen. And it was all thanks to a human who'd somehow managed to make her feel like she belonged. The night was quiet, save for the occasional hum of distant machinery from Jake's outpost. Nevira sat outside her ship, staring up at the twin moons. The repairs were coming along faster than she'd expected, but a part of her wasn't in a hurry to leave. Jake appeared, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. He handed one to her without a word, then settled on the ground beside her. "You really like this stuff, huh?" she said, taking a sip. "Comfort in a cup," he replied with a grin. "What about you? What's your go-to comfort thing?" She thought for a moment. "Back on Libran, I used to sit in the archives. It's a giant library filled with records from across the galaxy. I like getting lost in stories about other worlds, places where people didn't care about perfection." "Sounds peaceful," Jake said. "It was," she admitted. "Until someone reminded me I was wasting my time." Jake frowned. "Sounds like your people could use a lesson in minding their own business." She chuckled. "If only it were that simple." They fell into a comfortable silence, the warmth of the tea warding off the chill of the night. Nevira glanced at Jake, noting the way the moonlight softened his features. He looked almost vulnerable, a stark contrast to the confident explorer she'd come to know. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. Why are you here? On this planet, I mean." Jake sighed, leaning back on his elbows. "I needed a change. Back on Earth, I felt stuck. Like I was just going through the motions. Coming out here was my way of hitting reset." She nodded, understanding all too well. "So, we're both running away from something." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe we're just looking for something better." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Nevira looked away, her mind racing. She wasn't used to this feeling of connection, of being seen. It was both thrilling and terrifying. "You know," Jake said, breaking the tension, "you've got a pretty good sense of humor for someone who's supposedly imperfect." She smirked. "Are you saying I'm funny, human?" "Absolutely," he replied. "Hilarious, even. Though I'm still trying to figure out if it's intentional." "Careful," she said, her smirk widening. "Flattery might actually work on me." Jake laughed, his deep, genuine amusement warming her in a way the tea couldn't. She felt her defenses slipping, the walls she'd built around herself slowly crumbling. "You're different," she said, almost to herself. "Good different, I hope," he said, his tone teasing. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good different." The moment lingered, the silence between them no longer awkward but charged with something unspoken. Nevira felt her heart racing, a strange mix of excitement and fear coursing through her. "Jake," she said hesitantly. "Yeah?" She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for everything." He smiled, his blue eyes warm and steady. "Anytime." Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was tentative at first, a testing of boundaries, but it quickly deepened, fueled by the unspoken connection they'd been building. Jake's hand came up to cradle her face, his touch gentle but firm. Nevira felt her insecurities melt away, replaced by a warmth she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. And then, just as quickly as it began, the moment was interrupted. "Alert!" Blip's voice chimed, startling them both. "Unidentified fluid exchange detected. Please cease immediately." Jake pulled back, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "Did your AI just—" "Yes," Nevira said, her cheeks burning. "Blip, shut up! Monitoring systems indicate elevated heart rates and hormonal activity." Blip continued, oblivious to her mortification. "Would you like me to recommend relaxation techniques?" Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got one hell of a wingman, Nevira." "Blip, I swear to the stars, I will dismantle you," she growled. "Understood," Blip replied, finally going silent. Nevira buried her face in her hands, groaning. "I can't believe this is happening. Jake reached out, gently pulling her hands away. Hey, he said, his tone soft. Don't let it ruin the moment. Besides, it's not every day you get interrupted by an overprotective AI. Despite herself, she laughed, the tension easing. This is probably the most embarrassing moment of my life. I don't know, Jake said with a grin. I think it's kind of endearing. She rolled her eyes, but her smile betrayed her. You're impossible. And you're amazing, he said, his gaze steady. Her heart skipped a beat, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her defenses. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe it. They spent the rest of the night talking, their laughter echoing under the twin moons. The awkwardness of the interruption faded, replaced by a sense of ease that felt almost natural. For Nevira, it was a night she'd never forget, a moment of connection in a galaxy that had always felt cold and distant. The next morning, Nevira's ship was almost fully operational, thanks to Jake's persistent help. She had to admit, for someone unfamiliar with alien tech, he was surprisingly resourceful. As they worked on the final adjustments, a sharp beeping sound interrupted their progress. Nevira froze, recognizing the source instantly, her ship's emergency beacon. What is that? Jake asked, wiping his hands on a rag. It's a distress signal, she said, her voice tight. Someone from my species is trying to contact me. Jake frowned. That doesn't sound good. It's not, she muttered, hurrying to the cockpit. She activated the communications panel, her stomach twisting as the holographic image of a Libran elder flickered to life. The elder's cold, angular features filled the screen, his expression as disapproving as ever. Nevira, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. You've been difficult to locate. Not difficult enough, apparently, she said, crossing her arms. The elder's eyes narrowed. Do not test me, child. Your actions have brought shame upon our kind. Associating with a human? It's an affront to everything we stand for. Jake appeared behind her, his presence grounding her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, silently offering his support. I'm not coming back, Nevira said firmly. The elder's lip curled. You misunderstand. This is not a request. Return to Libran immediately, or face the consequences. And what are those? Jake interjected, his voice calm but with an edge that made Nevira's heart race. The elder's gaze shifted to Jake, his expression twisting into one of disgust. This primitive has no place in our affairs. Funny, Jake said, his tone unbothered. I feel the same way about you showing up uninvited. Nevira suppressed a smirk, but the elder was far from amused. You dare to speak to me this way? I dare, Jake said, stepping closer to the screen. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here and making demands. Nevira's not property, and she doesn't owe you anything. Nevira's chest tightened, the weight of years of rejection and judgment crashing over her. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. You don't understand our ways, the elder hissed. Maybe not, Jake said. But I understand respect. And you clearly don't have any for her. The elder's image flickered as his temper flared. Enough of this. Nevira, if you do not comply, you will be exiled permanently. You'll have no home, no family, nothing. Nevira's jaw clenched. I've already lived without those things. And you know what? I'm better off without them. Jake squeezed her shoulder gently, his silent encouragement giving her strength. Very well, the elder said coldly. But know this, your actions will not go unpunished. The transmission cut off, leaving the cockpit eerily silent. Well, Jake said after a moment, that went about as well as expected. Nevira let out a shaky laugh. You think? He turned her toward him, his hands resting on her shoulders. Hey, you okay? She nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Yeah. It's just hard. They've always made me feel like I wasn't enough, and now they've made it official. Jake's expression softened, his thumbs brushing against her arms. Listen to me. You are enough. More than enough. And if they can't see that, It's their loss. Her breath hitched, his words piercing through the self-doubt that had plagued her for so long. You really believe that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. With everything I've got, he said, his gaze steady. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and electric. But before either of them could say anything more, the ship's sensors blared. Incoming vessel detected, Blip announced. Nevira hurried to the control panel, her heart sinking as the screen displayed a Libran patrol ship approaching. Of course they'd send reinforcements, she muttered. Jake stood beside her, his jaw set. What do they want now? Probably to drag me back by force, she said. Not gonna happen, Jake said firmly. She glanced at him, her chest tightening at the determination in his eyes. Jake, this isn't your fight. Maybe not, he said. But I'm not letting them take you. The patrol ship hailed them, and Nevira reluctantly opened the channel. The Libran captain appeared on the screen, his expression as stern as the elders had been. Nevira, he said, you are hereby ordered to surrender and return to Libran custody. And if I don't? She challenged. Then we will have no choice but to take you by force, the captain said. Jake stepped forward, his stance protective. I'd like to see you try. The captain's gaze shifted to Jake, his disdain evident. And who are you to interfere? Her partner, Jake said without hesitation. Nevira's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. The captain sneered. Disgusting. Funny, Jake said, his tone casual. I was about to say the same thing about your attitude. The captain bristled, but before he could respond, Nevira spoke up. Enough. I'm not going back, and you can't make me. She's made her choice, Jake added. Now leave before things get ugly. The captain hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he let out a frustrated growl. You've made a grave mistake, Nevira. Don't expect mercy when you realize it. The transmission ended, and the patrol ship veered off, disappearing into the distance. Nevira exhaled, the tension draining from her body. That was intense. Jake grinned. You handled it like a champ. She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. I couldn't have done it without you. Well, he said, his grin widening. Guess that makes us a pretty good team. Yeah, she said softly. I guess it does. The days that followed were quieter, though the tension of what had just transpired still lingered. Nevira found herself looking over her shoulder more often than she'd like, but Jake's presence was a steady reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. They had survived the confrontation with the Librans, but more than that, they had chosen to face it together. Jake spent his time preparing the outposts, reinforcing the security systems and checking on supplies. Nevira helped where she could, though she often found herself watching him instead. There was a steadiness to his movements, a quiet confidence that drew her in. You keep staring at me like that, and I'll start charging rent, he teased one afternoon, not even looking up from the control panel he was adjusting. Don't flatter yourself. She shot back, though the corner of her mouth twitched upward. His laughter filled the space, warm and unguarded. She liked that about him, how easy he made everything feel, even in the middle of a crisis. Later, as they shared a meal of ration packs and more of Jake's questionable tea, the conversation turned to lighter topics. So, he said, leaning back in his chair, if you had to describe Libran food in one word, what would it be? She considered this for a moment. Slimy. He raised an eyebrow. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on your perspective, she said with a smirk. It's an acquired taste. Jake chuckled. Remind me not to order the Libran special if I ever visit your planet. You wouldn't last 5 minutes on Libran, she said, her tone teasing. Our gravity would crush you like a bug. Good thing I'm not planning any trips, he replied, his grin widening. The banter was easy, natural, and for the first time in years, Nevira felt herself relax. She hadn't realized how much she needed this, someone who could make her laugh, who could remind her that not everything had to be a battle. As the suns dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jake stood and offered her his hand. "Come on," he said. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. She hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, letting him lead her outside. They walked in silence, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Jake stopped near the edge of the crater, where the ground sloped upward to form a small hill. He gestured for her to sit, then plopped down beside her, his eyes fixed on the sky. "What's so special about this spot?" she asked, following his gaze. "You'll see," he repeated, his tone softer this time. For a while, they sat in silence, watching as the first stars began to appear. The sky seemed to stretch on forever, an endless expanse of possibilities. "You know," Jake said after a while, "this is the first time in a long time I've felt content." She glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Content?" "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Out here, it's easy to forget what really matters. But meeting you, it's reminded me of a lot of things. Like how important it is to have someone who sees you for who you are." Her chest tightened, his words cutting through her usual defenses. "Jake." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. And I know I can't fix everything. But I want you to know I'm here. Whatever happens, I'm here." Her breath caught, the sincerity in his voice leaving her momentarily speechless. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "Good or bad?" he asked, a hint of teasing in his tone. "Good," she said, her voice soft. "Definitely good." They sat in silence again, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Nevira wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like it didn't matter. She wasn't alone anymore, and that was enough. As the stars continued to fill the sky, Jake reached over and took her hand. She didn't pull away, her fingers curling around his. "Guess this makes us a team," he said, his voice laced with humor. "A pretty unconventional one," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She looked at him, the warmth in his gaze melting away the last of her doubts. Maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found what she'd been searching for. And as they sat under the endless expanse of stars, Nevira allowed herself to hope.